I am entirely at a loss, upon my honor, and so I lay the position before you, confiding wholly in your candor. I am entirely at a loss. I cannot for the life of me conceive what manner of offense it was not my landing of those monstrously unjust prisoners on Dragon Island, though he certainly disapproved it. For the trouble began before that, quite early in the morning. Stephen listened gravely, attentively, never interrupting, and very slowly harking back for details overlooked and forward to straighten his chronology by anticipation. Jack laid before him the history of his relations with James Dillon, good, bad, with his last extraordinary descent not only inexplicable, but strangely wounding, because of the real liking that had grown up in addition to the esteem. Then there was Marshall's unaccountable conduct too. But that was of much less importance. With the utmost care, Jack reiterated his arguments about the necessity for having a happy ship if one was to command an efficient fighting machine. He quoted examples of like and contrary cases, and his audience listened and approved. Stephen could not bring his wisdom to the resolution of any of these difficulties, however, nor, as Jack would somewhat ignobly have liked, could he propose his good offices. For he was a merely ideal interlocutor, and his thinking flesh lay 30 leagues to the south and west across a waste of sea. A rough waste and a cross sea. After frustrating days of calm light airs and then a strong southwester, the wind had backed easterly in the night, and now it was blowing a gale across the wave that had built up during the day, so that the Sophie went thumping along under double-reefed topsails and courses, the cross sea breaking over her weather bow and soaking the lookout on the forecastle with a grateful spray. Healing James Dillon as he stood on the quarter deck communing with the devil, and rocking the cot in which Jack silently harangued the darkness. His was an exceedingly busy life, and yet since he entered an inviolable solitude, the moment he passed the sentry at his cabin door, it left him a great deal of time for reflection. It was not frittered away in very small exchanges, in listening to 3/4 of a scale in a quavering German flute or in sailors' politics. I shall speak to him when we pick him up. I shall speak in the most general way of the comfort it is to a man to have a confidential friend aboard, and of the singularity in the sailor's life, that one moment he is so on top of his shipmates, all hugger-mugger in the wardroom that he can hardly breathe, let alone play anything but a jig on the fiddle, and the next he is pitched into a kind of hermit's solitude. Something he was never known before. In times of stress, Jack Aubrey had two main reactions. He either became aggressive or he became amorous. He longed either for the violent catharsis of action and for that of making love. He loved a battle. He loved a wench. I quite understand that sometimes commanders take a girl to sea with them, he reflected. Apart from the pleasure, think of the refuge of sinking into a warm, lively, affectionate peace. I wish there was a girl in this cabin, he added after a pause. This disarray, this open acknowledged incomprehension were kept solely for his cabin and his ghostly companion. The outward appearance of the Sophie's captain had nothing hesitant about it, and it would have been a singularly acute observer to tell that the nascent friendship between him and his lieutenant had been cut short. The master was such an observer, however, for although Jack's truly hideous appearance when singed and greased had caused a revulsion for a while, at the same time Jack's obvious liking for James Dillon had set up a jealousy that worked in the contrary direction. Furthermore, the master had been threatened in terms that left almost no room for doubt. In very nearly direct terms, and so for an entirely different cause, he watched the captain and the lieutenant with painful anxiety. "Mr. Marshall," said Jack in the darkness, and the poor man jumped as though a pistol had been fired behind him. "When do you reckon we shall raise the land?" "In about 2 hours' time, sir, in this wind, if this wind holds." "Yes, I thought as much," said Jack, gazing up into the rigging. "I believe you may shake out a reef now, however, and at any further slackening set the top gallants, crack on all you can, and have me called when land is seen, if you please, Mr. Marshall." Something less than 2 hours later, he reappeared to view the remote irregular line on the starboard bow, Spain with the singular mountain the English called Egg Top Hill, in line with the best bower anchor, and their watering bay, therefore, directly ahead. "By God, you're a prime navigator, Marshal," he said, lowering his glass. "You deserve to be master of the fleet." It would take them at least an hour to run in, however, and now that the event was so close at hand, no longer at all theoretical, Jack discovered how anxious he was, in fact, how very much the outcome mattered to him. "Send my coxswain aft, will you?" he said, returning to his cabin after he had taken half a dozen uneasy turns. Barrett Bondon, coxswain and captain of the maintop, was unusually young for his post, a fine open-looking creature, tough without brutality, cheerful, perfectly in his place, and of course, a prime seaman. Bred to the sea from childhood. "Sit down, Bondon," said Jack, a little consciously, for what he was about to offer was the quarter-deck, no less, and the possibility of advancement to the very pinnacle of the sailor's hierarchy. "I have been thinking, should you like to be rated midshipman?" "Why, no, sir, not at all," answered Bondon at once, his teeth flashing in the gloom. "But I thank you very kindly for your good opinion, sir." "Oh," said Jack, taken aback, "why not?" "I ain't got the learning, sir." "Why," laughing cheerfully, "it's all I can do to tread the watch list, spelling it out slow, and I'm too old to wear round now. And then, sir, what should I look like? Rigged out like an officer, Jack in the green, and my old messmates laughing up their sleeves and calling out, 'What ho, the hawsehole!' Plenty of fine officers began on the lower deck," said Jack. "I was on the lower deck myself once," he added, regretting the sequence as soon as he uttered it. "I know you was, sir," said Bondon, and his grin flashed again. How did you know that?" "We got a cove in the starboard watch, was shipmates with you, sir, in the old Resso off the Cape." Oh dear," cried Jack inwardly, "and I never noticed him. So there I was, turning all the women ashore, as righteous as Pompous Pilate, and they knew all the time. Well, and aloud, with a certain stiffness, 'Well, Bondon, think of what I have said. It would be a pity to stand in your own way.' "If I may make so bold, sir," said Bondon, getting to his feet and standing there suddenly constrained, lumpish and embarrassed. "There's my Aunt Sloper's George Luckock, foretopman, larboard watch. He's a right scholar, can write so small you can scarcely see it. Younger nor I am, and more people, sir, far more people." "Lukock," said Jack dubiously. "He's only a lad. Was not he flogged last week?" "Yes, sir, but it was only his gun had won again, and he couldn't hold back from his draught, not in duty to the giver." "Well," said Jack, reflecting that perhaps there might be wiser prizes than a bottle, though none so valued, "I will keep an eye on him." Midshipmen were much in his mind during his tedious working in. "Mr. Babington," he said suddenly, stopping in his up and down, "take your hands out of your pockets. When did you last write home?" Mr. Babington was at an age when almost any question evokes a guilty response, and this was, in fact, a valid accusation. He reddened and said, "I don't know, sir." "Think, sir, think," said Jack, his good-tempered face clouding unexpectedly. "What port did you send it from? Mahon, Leghorn, Genoa, Gibraltar? Well, never mind. There was no dark figure to be made out on that distant beach. Never mind. Write a handsome letter, 2 pages at least, and send it in to me with your daily workings tomorrow. Give your father my compliments and tell him my bankers are whores." For Jack, like most other captains, managed the youngsters' parental allowance for them. "Whores," he repeated absently once or twice. "My bankers are whores." And a strangled, ugly, crowing noise made him turn. Young Ricketts was clinging to the fall of the main Burton tackle in an attempt to control himself, but without much success. Jack's cold glare chilled his mirth, however, and he was able to reply to, "And you, Mr. Ricketts, have you written to your parents recently?" With an audible "No, sir," that scarcely quavered at all. "Then you will do the same. 2 pages, wrote small, and no demands for new quadrants, laced hats, or hangers," said Jack, and something told the midshipman that this was no time to expostulate, to point out that his loving parent, his only parent, was in daily, even hourly, communication with him. Indeed, this awareness of Jack's state of tension was general thought the brig. Goldilocks is in a rare old taking about with a doctor. They said, watch out for squalls. And when hammocks were piped up, the seamen who had to pass by him to stow theirs in the starboard quarterdeck netting glanced at him nervously, one trying to keep an eye on the quartermaster and on the break of the deck, and on his captain, all at the same time fell flat on his face. But Goldilocks was not the only one to be anxious by any manner of means, and when Stephen Mazarin was at his last seen to walk out of the trees and cross the beach to meet the jolly boat, a general exclamation of "There he is!" broke out from waist to forecastle in defiance of good discipline. Huzzay! "How very glad I am to see you," cried Jack, as Stephen groped his way aboard, pushed and pulled by well-meaning hands. "How are you, my dear sir? Come and breakfast directly. I have held it back on purpose. How do you find yourself? Tolerably spry, I hope. Tolerably spry?" "I am very well, I thank you," said Stephen, who indeed looked somewhat less cadaverous, flushed as he was with pleasure at the open friendliness of his welcome. "I will take a look at my sick bay, and then I will share your bacon with the utmost pleasure. Good morning, Mr. Day. Take off your hat, if you please. Very neat, very neat. You do us credit, Mr. Day, but no exposure to the sun as yet. I recommend the wearing of a close Welsh wig. Cheslin, good morning to you. You have a good account of our patients, I trust." "That," he said, "a little greasy from bacon, that was a point that exercised my mind a great deal during your absence. Would my loblolly boy pay the men back in their own coin? Would they return to their persecution of him? How quickly could he come by a new identity?" "Identity," said Jack comfortably, pouring out more coffee. "Is not identity something you are born with? The identity I am thinking of is something that hovers between a man and the rest of the world, a midpoint between his view of himself and theirs of him, for each, of course, affects the other continually, a reciprocal fluxion, sir. There is nothing absolute about this identity of mine. Were you personally, to spend some days in Spain, at present, you would find yours change, you know, because of the general opinion that you are a false, harsh, brutal, murdering villain, an odious man." "I dare say they are vexed," said Jack, smiling, "and I dare say they call me Beelzebub, but that don't make me Beelzebub." Does it not? Does it not? Ah, well, however that may be, you have angered, you have stirred up the mercantile interest along the coast to a most prodigious degree. There is a wealthy man by the name of Mateau who is wonderfully incensed against you. The quicksilver belonged to him, and being contraband, it was not insured. So did the vessel you cut out as Almoreira, and the cargo of the tartan burnt off Tortosa, half of that was his. He is well with the ministry. He has moved their indolence, and they have allowed him and his friends to charter one of their men of war. No charter, my dear sir. No private person can possibly charter a man of war, a national vessel, a king's ship, not even in Spain. Oh, perhaps I used the wrong term. I often use the wrong term in naval matters. However, a ship of force, not only to protect the coasting trade, but even more to pursue the Sophie, who is perfectly well known now, but by name and by description. This I had from Mateau's own cousin as we danced." "You danced?" cried Jack, far more astonished than if Stephen had said, "as we ate our cold roast baby." "Certainly I danced. Why would I not dance, pray?" "Certainly you are to dance, most uncommon graceful, I am sure. I only wondered, but did you indeed go about dancing?" "I did. You have not traveled in Catalonia, sir, I believe." "Not I. Then I must tell you that on Sunday mornings it is the custom in that country for people of all ages and conditions to dance on coming out of church. So I was dancing with Ramon Mateau, Catalfach, in the square before the Cathedral Church of Tarragona, where I had gone to hear the Palestrina Missa Brevis. The dance is a particular dance, a round called the Sardana, and if you will reach me your fiddle, I will play you the air of the one I have in mind, though you must imagine I am a harsh, braying hautboy plays. It is a charming melody, to be sure, somewhat in the Moorish taste, is it not? But upon my word, it makes my flesh creep to think of you rambling about the countryside and ports and towns. I'd imagined you would have gone to earth, that you would have kept close with your friend, hidden in her room, that is to say. Yet I had told you, had I not, that I could ride the length and breadth of that country without a question or a moment's uneasiness. So you had, Jack reflected for a while, and so, of course, if you chose, you could find out what ships and convoys were sailing when expected, how laden, and so on. Even the galleons themselves, I dare say. Certainly I could, said Stephen. If I chose to play the spy, it is a curious and apparently illogical set of notions, is it not, that makes it right and natural to speak of the Sophie's enemies. Yet beyond any question wrong, dishonorable, and indecent to speak of her prey. Yes, said Jack, looking at him wistfully. You must give a hare her law, there is no doubt. But what do you tell me about this ship of force? What is her rate? How many guns does she carry? Where does she lie? Cacafuego is her name. Cacafuego. I have never heard of her. So at least she cannot be a ship of the line. How is she rigged? Stephen paused. I am ashamed to say I did not ask. He said, but from the satisfaction with which her name was pronounced, I take her to be some prepotent great argosy. Well, we must try to keep out of her way, and since she knows what we look like, we must try to change our appearance. It is wonderful what a coat of paint and a waistcloth will do, or even oddly patched jib or a fished topmast. By the way, I suppose they told you in the boat why we were compelled to maroon you. They told me about the frigates and your boarding the American. Yes, and precious stuff it was, too. There was no such people aboard. Dillon searched her for close on an hour. I was just as glad, for I remembered you had told me the United Irishmen were good creatures on the whole, far better than those other fellows whose name I forget. Steel boys, white boys, orange boys. United Irishmen, I had understood them to be French. They told me the American ship had been searched for some Frenchmen. They were only pretending to be Frenchmen. That is to say, if they had been there at all, they might have pretended to be French. That is why I sent Dillon, who speaks it so well. But they were not, you see, and in my opinion the whole thing was so much cock. I was just as glad as I say, but it seemed to upset Dillon most strangely. I suppose he was very eager to take them, or he was very much put out at our cruise being cut short. Ever since then, however, I must not bore you with all that. You heard about the prisoners, that the frigates had been so good as to give you 50 of theirs, merely for their own convenience. It was not for the good of the service at all. A most shabby, unscrupulous thing, cried Jack, his eyes starting from his head at the recollection. But I dished him, though. As soon as we were done with the American, we bore away for the Amelia, told her we had drawn a blank and made our signal for parting company. And a couple of hours later, the wind serving, we landed every man, Jack, on Dragon Island, off Majorca. Just so. But is not that wrong? Will you not be reproved, court-martialed? Jack winced, and clapping his hand to wood, he said, pray never sail that ill-conditioned word. The mere sound of it is enough to spoil the day. Not if I put into Mahon with a thundering great prize at my tail, said Jack, laughing, for now we may just have time to go and lie off Barcelona. Do you see? If the wind is kind, I have quite set my heart upon it. We shall just have time for a quick stroke or two, and then we must bear away for Mahon with anything we may have caught. For we certainly cannot spare another prize crew with our numbers so reduced, and we certainly cannot stay out much longer without we eat our boots. Still and all, never look so concerned, dear doctor. There was no specific order as to where to land them, no order at all. And of course, I'll square the head money. Besides, I am covered. All my officers formally agreed that our shortage of water and provisions compelled us to do so. Marshall and Ricketts and even Dillon, although he was so chuff and pope-holy about it all. The Sophie reeked of grilled sardines and fresh paint. She lay 15 miles off Cape Tortosa in a dead calm, wallowing on the oily swell, and the blue smoke of the sardines he had bought out of the night fishing Barcalonga. She had bought the whole catch, still hung sickeningly about her tweed decks, her sails and rigging half an hour after dinner. The boatswain had a large working party slung over her side, spreading yellow paint over the neat dockyard black and white. The sail maker and a dozen palm and pricket men were busy at a long, narrow strip of canvas designed to conceal her warlike character, and her lieutenant was pulling round her in the jolly boat to judge of the effect. He was alone, except for her surgeon, and he was saying, everything. I did everything in my power to avoid it. Everything, breaking all measures. I altered course. I shortened sail, unthinkable in the service, blackmailing the master to do so. And yet in the morning there she lay 2 miles away under our lee, where she had no conceivable right to be. Ahoy, Mr. Watt! 6 inches lower all round. It was just as well. If any other man had gone aboard, they might have been taken. A pause, and James said, he leant over the table so close I had this stinking breath in my face, and with a hateful yellow look, he poured out this ugly stuff. I had already made up my mind, as I said, yet it looked exactly as though I were yielding to a vulgar threat, and 2 minutes later I was sure I had. But you had not. It is a sick fancy. Indeed, it is not far from morose delectation. Take great care of that sin, James, I beg. And as for the rest, it is a pity you mind it so. What does it amount to in the long run? A man would have to be 3 parts dead not to mind it so, and quite dead to a sense of duty, to say nothing of. Mr. Watt, that will do very well. Stephen sat there, weighing the advantage of saying, do not hate Jack Aubrey for it. Do not drink so much. Do not destroy yourself for what will not last against the disadvantage of setting off an explosion. For in spite of his apparent calm, James Dillon was on a hair trigger in a state of pitiful exacerbation. Stephen could not decide, shrugged, lifting his right hand, palm upwards in a gesture that meant, bah, let it go. And to himself he observed, however, I shall oblige him to take a black draught this evening. Then at least I can do, and some comfortable mandragora, and in my diary I shall write, J.D. required to play Iscariot either with his right hand or with his left, and hating the necessity, the absolute necessity, concentrates all this hatred upon poor J.A., which is a remarkable instance of the human process, for in fact, J.D. does not like J.A. at all. Far from it. At least, said James, pulling back to the sofa, I do hope that after all this discreditable shuffling, we may be taken into action. It has a wonderful way of reconciling a man with himself and with everybody else sometimes. What is that fellow in the buff waistcoat doing on the quarter-deck? That is Prem. Captain Aubrey is dressing him as a Danish officer. It is part of our plan of disguise. Do not you remember the yellow waistcoat the master of the Clomber wore? It is customary with them. I do not. Tell me, do such things often happen at sea? Oh, yes. It is a perfectly legitimate ruse de guerre. After we amuse the enemy with false signals, too. Anything but those of distress. Take great care of the paint now. At this point, Stephen fell straight into the sea, into the hollow of the sea between the boat and the side of the sloop as they drew away from one another. He sank at once, rose just as they came together, struck his head between the two and sank again, bubbling. Most of the Sophie's people who could swim leapt into the water, Jack among them, and others ran with boat hooks, a dolphin striker, 2 small grapnels, an ugly barbed hook on a chain. But it was the brother Sponge that found him 5 fathoms down, heavy bones for his size, no fat, lead-soled half-boots, and brought him up. His clothes blacker than usual, his face more white, and he screaming with water, furiously indignant. It was no epic-making event, but it was a useful one, since it provided the gun-room with a topic of conversation at a moment when very hard work was needed to maintain the appearance of a civilized community. A good deal of the time James was heavy, inattentive, and silent. His eyes were bloodshot from the grog he swallowed, but it seemed neither to cheer nor yet to fuddle him. The master was almost equally withdrawn, and he sat there, stealing covert glances at Dillon from time to time. So when they were all at table, they went into the subject of swimming quite exhaustively. Its rarity among seamen, its advantages, the preservation of life, the pleasure to be derived from it. In suitable climates, the carrying of a line ashore in an emergency, its disadvantages, the prolongation of death agonies and shipwreck, and falling overboard unseen, flying in the face of nature had God meant men to swim, etc., the curious inability of young seals to swim, the use of bladders, the best ways of learning and practicing the art of swimming. The only right way to swim, said Purser for the 7th time, is to join your hands like you were saying your prayers. He narrowed his eyes, joined his hands very exactly, and shoot them out so. This time he did strike the bottle, which plunged violently into the Solomon Grundy and thence, deep in thick gravy, into Marshall's lap. "I knew you would do it," cried the master, springing about and mopping himself. "I told you so," I said. "Sooner or later, you'll knock down that damned decanter, and you can't swim a stroke, prating like a horse on otter. You have wrecked my best nankeen trousers." "I didn't go for to do it," said the purser sullenly, and the evening relapsed into a barbarous gloom. Indeed, as the Sophie beat up tack upon tack to the northward, she could not have been described as a very cheerful sloop. In his beautiful little cabin, Jack sat reading Steele's Navy List and feeling low, not so much because he had overeaten again, and not so much because of the great number of men senior to him on the list, as because he was so aware of this feeling aboard. He could not know the precise nature of the complicated miseries inhabiting Dillon and Marshall. He could not tell that 3 yards from him, James Dillon was trying to fend off despair with a series of invocations and a haggard attempt at resignation, while the whole of his mind that was not taken up with increasingly mechanical prayer converted its unhappy turmoil into hatred for the established order, for authority, and so for captains, and for all those who, never having had a moment's conflict of duty or honor in their lives, could condemn him out of hand. And although Jack could hear the master's shoes crunching on the deck some inches above his head, he could not possibly divine the particular emotional disturbance and the sickening dread of exposure that filled the poor man's loving heart. But he knew very well that his tight, self-contained world was hopelessly out of tune, and he was haunted by the depressing sentiment of failure, of not having succeeded in what he had set out to do. He would very much have liked to ask Stephen Maturin the reasons for this failure. He would very much have liked to talk to him on indifferent subjects and have played a little music. But he knew that an invitation to the captain's cabin was very like an order, if only because the refusing of it was so extraordinary, that had been borne in upon him very strongly the other morning when he had been so amazed by Dillon's refusal. Where there was no equality, there was no companionship. When a man was obliged to say, "Yes, sir," his agreement was of no worth, even if it happened to be true. He had known these things all his service life. They were perfectly evident, but he had never thought they would apply so fully, and to him. Farther down in the sloop, in the almost deserted midshipman's berth, the melancholy was even more profound. The youngsters were, in fact, weeping as they sat. Ever since Mowat and Pullings had gone off in prizes, these two had been at watch and watch, which meant that neither ever had more than 4 hours' sleep, hard at that dormouse, love-bed age that so clings to its warm hammock. Then again, in writing their dutiful letters, they had contrived to cover themselves with ink, and had been sharply rebuked for their appearance. What is more, Babington, unable to think of anything to put, had filled his pages with asking after everybody at home and in the village, human beings, dogs, horses, cats, birds, and even the great hall clock, to such an extent that he was now filled with an overwhelming nostalgia. He was also afraid that his hair and teeth were going to fall out and his bones soften, while sores and blotches covered his face and body, the inevitable result of conversing with harlots, as the wise old experienced clerk Richards had assured him. Young Ricketts' woe had quite another source. His father had been talking of a transfer into a store ship, of a transport, as being safer and far more homelike, and young Ricketts had accepted the prospect of separation with wonderful fortitude. But now it appeared that there was to be no separation, that he, young Ricketts, was to go too, torn from the Sophie, and the life he loved so passionately. Marshall, seeing him staggering with weariness, had sent him below, and there he sat on his sea chest, resting his face in his hands at 3:30 a.m, too tired even to creep into his hammock, and the tears oozed between his fingers. Before the Mass there was much less sadness, although there were several men, far more than usual, who looked forward with no pleasure to Thursday morning, when they were to be flogged. Most of the others had nothing positive to be glum about, apart from the hard work and the short commons, yet nevertheless the Sophie was already so very much of a community that every man aboard was conscious of something out of joint, something more than their officers' snappishness. What, they could not tell, but it took away their ordinary genial flow. The gloom on the quarter-deck seeped forward, reaching as far as the goat-house, the manger, and even the haw-holes themselves. The Sophie, then considered as an entity, was not at the top of her form as she worked through the night on the dying Tramontana. Yet in the morning, when the northerly weather was followed, as it so often happens in those waters, by wreathing mists from the southwest, very lovely for those who do not have to navigate a vessel through them, close inshore, and the forerunners of a blazing day. But this state was nothing in comparison with the tense alarm, not to say the dejection and even dread that Stephen discovered when he stepped onto the quarter-deck just at sunrise. He had been woken by the drum beating to quarters. He had gone directly to the cockpit, and there, with Cheslin's help, he had arranged his instruments. A bright, eager face from the upper regions had announced a thundering great xebec round the cape, right in with the land. He acknowledged with this mild approval, and after a while he fell to sharpening his catlin. Then he sharpened his lancets, and then his flame-toothed saw with a little hone that he had bought for the purpose in Tortosa. Time passed, and the face was replaced by another, a very much altered, pallid face that delivered the captain's compliments and desired him to come on deck. "Good morning, Doctor," said Jack, and Stephen noticed that his smile was strained, his eyes hard and wary. "It looks as though he had a tartar." He nodded over the water towards a long, sharp, strikingly beautiful vessel, bright light red against the sullen cliffs behind. She lay low in the water for her size, 4 times the Sophie's bulk, but a high kind of flying platform carried out her stern so that it jutted far over her counter, while a singular beak-like projection advanced her prow a good 20 feet beyond her stem. Her main and mizzen masts bore immense curved double-tapering lateen yards, whose sails were spilling the southeast air to allow the Sophie to come up with her. And even at this distance, Stephen noticed that the yards, too, were red. Her starboard broadside, facing the Sophie, had no less than 16 gun ports in it, and her decks were extraordinarily crowded with men. "A 32-gun xebec frigate," said Jack, "and she cannot be anything but Spanish. Her hanging ports deceived us entirely. Thought she was a merchantman until the last moment. And nearly all her hands were down below. Mr. Dillon, get a few more people out of sight without its showing. Mr. Marshall, 3 or 4 men, no more, to shake out the reef in the foretop sail. They are to do it slowly like lubbers. Anderson, call out something in Danish again. Let that bucket dangle over the side." In a lower voice to Stephen, "You see her, the Fox. Those ports opened 2 minutes ago, quite hidden by all that bloody paintwork. And although she was thinking of swaying up her square yards, look at her foremast. She can have that lateen back in a moment and snap us up directly. We must stand on, no choice, and see whether we can't amuse her. Mr. Ricketts, you have the flags ready to hand.